afternoon, everyone. I'm Wan-Chen from the University of Washington, and that's a long title, thank you. So this is the outline of my presentation today, and I would like to first start from talking about how culture influences classification and how that can lead to ethical issues. And then, since we're talking about culture, I did a literature review in both knowledge organization domain and the anthropology to see how people define culture. And then based on that, I proposed a definition of culture that I would like to use in my future research related to ethical and cultural issue related to classifications. And then I would like to wrap up this talk by pointing to some ethical issues related to culture in knowledge organization. So, adopting standardized classifications like DDC and LCC has been a practice around the many regions around the world, and there's of course incentives of doing so. From a library's perspective, it can reduce the cost of developing and maintaining classification, as well as reduce the cost of cataloging and improve the collaboration between institutions. However, adopting standardized classifications can lead to ethical issues, and that is where culture kick in this conversation. So, as this research shows that we know, culture is a critical factor that affects classification. Bechtel lists culture as one of the warrants that justify classificationist decision makings, like the unit of analysis of a classification, the depth of division of a classification, etc. And Hope Olson point out that classification is a very good representation of mainstream cultures, and not only represent it, but reinforce them. So through this process, while the classification reinforces the mainstream cultures, it can marginalize some subcultures that is not included, and thus lead to ethical issues. And Lopez Urtas, in her studies, she tried to highlight how culture affects classification by comparing how different cultures organize the same subject topic, and it turns out to be really different. And my highlight how we as information professionals value ethical information services. And in order to achieve this goal, he advocated for developing a domain practice-based ethical classifications that value culture and context. So these people are not the only ones who are talking about culture and classification. If we look at this is a scanned image of one page of the preface of Nippon Decimal Classification, the first edition, published in 1929 by Mori. And Mori, at that time, he justifies why he has to develop their own, like the Japan's own decimal classification, instead of just adopt, at that time already well-defined, well-developed DDC. At that time, DDC has gone to the 12th edition already. So it's kind of tempting to just adopt it or other standardized classifications. But he did not, because he pointed out two main concerns. One is that there might be some criticism about religion, law, literature, and history classes that might not fit into the Japanese culture. And another issue is the arrangement, the prioritization of Japan-related materials might not be able to achieve if they just adopt a standardized classification. And by the way, the text is a translation of the underlying part. Okay? So, since Mori's so explicit about all the particular classes that he's worried about, let's do a comparison. So this is a comparison mapping between DDC and NDC, the 22nd edition and the 9th edition. They are used in the overlap period. And if we look at the religion, it's pretty obvious it's quite different, right? So in DDC, Christianity is the main focus, and all the other religions are sharing 290. While in NDC, religions share the same class with philosophy. And among the four, like from 160 to 190, we see Shinto, Buddhism, and Christianity are the three main focus, while all the other religions share 160. Okay. And okay, so we know that culture is critical and it affects classification. But if we step back and think about when we say culture, we say that a lot in our daily conversation. We use it in a way that we assume our listeners know what we're talking about when we use culture. But then if we think again, culture can mean a lot of different things. And so I did a literature review to see how people define culture. And compile 5 families of definitions of culture. So the first one is culture as nationality or geographical region, like Japanese culture, the US culture, the East Asia culture, or the Middle East culture. And what some people see culture as context, like the Islamic culture, the Iranian culture, and Geertz talks about culture as context. It's a system of symbols in which we can thickly describe the symbols and interpret their meanings. Culture is also seen as collective phenomenon. You see 4 authors listed here. They do not all agree with a specific definition. They all provide their own. But they share 2 critical concepts. That's why I put them under this umbrella category called collective phenomenon. The 2 concepts are, the first one is members learn culture from their fellow members that belong to the same group. And the second concept is that culture is what distinguishes people within a group and those who are not belong to the same group. And the 4th definition is culture as all transmitted social knowledge. As you can see, there are 10 definitions because Kluckhohn tries so hard to cover all aspects of culture. And it shows how broad culture can cover. It covers from civilization to knowledge to human-made part of the world, which is what Menu proposed. Menu thinks culture is human-made part environment, and he further divide them into objective material culture and subjective non-material culture. And objective and subjective here means within a person or outside of a person. Okay. And objective material culture is further divided into artifacts and observable patterns. So yeah, there are 5 families of definition, and when I was reviewing the literature, I realized a lot of the researchers, they wanted to help their readers to understand this abstract culture, like cultural concept. So a lot of times they provide a list of manifestations of culture to give examples. And there's a lot. So I find it helpful to just put them in a concept map and show them like this. That includes like values, tradition, and symbols. Besides this, some people also provide content of culture, which are elements that consist of culture. That includes like belief, art, knowledge, expectations of behaviors, etc. So then I find there are some overlaps between the 2 groups of concepts. And when we look at this map, these 3 maps, and besides thinking, oh, what a mess, we might ask, is it really necessary to distinguish manifestation of culture and the content of culture? Like, what is the point of distinguishing them? Well, Geertz and Kluckhohn and Goodenough, the 3 authors, explicitly state that the importance of distinguish the 2 because by looking at how users create and interact with cultural manifestations and understand the meaning of them can help us develop and compare models or theories of culture and really do the study of culture itself. So because of the complexity and because of the suggestions of previous researchers, I find it useful to focus on an object of study, that is how users' use of classification here as a cultural manifestation. So with this in mind, it reminds me of the 3rd space model that's often applied to libraries. So in her sense, she explained that 3rd space is a dynamic space between the cataloged documents and library users. It is a space where users construct meanings. So in this sense, librarians can be a third space. LCSH can be a third space. Classification itself can be a third space. And with this in mind, and under this context, I would like to propose a definition of culture that I would like to use in my future work. It is seeing culture as a cognitive framework constructed by a community, and the framework influences how people within the community perceive the world. It's lagging? Okay. So after these discussions, I'd like to talk about some ethical issues that are related to culture in knowledge organization. The first one is unequal access. So if we see classification as infrastructure, which is borrowing the Balker and Starr infrastructure studies here, we figure, okay, yeah, classification shares some characteristics of infrastructure, and one of which is becoming visible upon breaking down. It may be easy when we're thinking about railroad systems, right? We take trains every day, we kind of taken it for granted, it becomes kind of invisible in our life, but when it breaks down, it's really inconvenient to us and it becomes visible. And it's the same way as classification, right? So if a user share the same culture of which the classification originates from, then yeah, there's no sense-making gap. It totally makes sense to the user, and he or she can just navigate through the system and get the information he or she wants. But then if there's a user that does not share the same culture that is embedded in the classification, then there might be a mismatch between the user's expectation and the function of the classification. And when the mismatch happens, the classification breaks down and becomes visible, and people start to ask what's wrong with it, right? So if there is this different levels of difficulty for people from different cultural backgrounds to use the same classification, then yes, it can be an ethical issue that causes unequal access. The second one I would like to talk about is the dilemma of standardization and localization. So infrastructure has this paradoxical nature. On one hand, it has to build on an embedded, established standards so it can serve people's needs transparently. But then, on the other hand, it is relational and contextual. It needs flexibility. And it's the same when we look at classification. The standardization of classification is built on an established practice of copycat logging. We have all these established systems, we have a lot of participants, libraries working together. And natural externality is a concept here to explain the motivation of adopting standardized classification, because the more participants there are, the more positive externality everyone gets, like when we're doing copycat logging. But then, from the literature we reviewed, we also know that classification is highly cultural and value sensitive and contextual. So that's another force that calls for localization. And there's these two forces pulling to opposite direction and causing the tension between standardization and localization. And if I may remind you of the 1929 NDC, you can see Maury at that time, he was already thinking about and discussing about this problem. And we are still trying to figure it out now today. All right, that's